Caught between power and love, James stands at the edge of an impossible choice. On one side lies authority, legacy, and everything he was raised to inherit. On the other is Diep, the woman who taught him what his heart truly needs. To choose one means losing the other. As the weight of the decision closes in, the question burns. Will James dare to trade power for love, or sacrifice love to keep the crown?
The city never truly slept, but that night it seemed to hold its breath. Lights shimmered behind glass towers, contracts lay open on polished desks, and somewhere between the hum of traffic and the ticking of a wall clock, James felt his heart hesitate. Power had always spoken to him in a clear, confident voice. It promised certainty, control, and the quiet respect of rooms where decisions were made. Yet now that voice was interrupted by another, softer, warmer, and far more dangerous to ignore. It was the voice that sounded like Diep. He stood alone in his office, fingers resting on the edge of the window, looking down at the city that had shaped him. Years of effort had carried him here. Every late night, every sacrifice, every carefully calculated step had built a version of James who knew how to win. In this world, love was supposed to be an accessory, not a priority. Feelings were meant to be managed, not allowed to interfere. That was the rule he had lived by, until Diep quietly stepped into his life and rewrote it without asking permission. Diep was nothing like the people James usually met. She did not speak in numbers or negotiations. She spoke in small truths, shared meals, patient listening, gentle laughter that softened the sharp edges of his days. With her, life felt slower, almost fragile, as if one careless move could break something precious. She reminded him of ordinary moments most people took for granted, waiting for someone to come home, worrying about tomorrow, hoping without guarantees. And strangely, those moments frightened him more than any hostile boardroom ever had.
The pressure began subtly. A suggestion here, a warning there. Powerful voices hinted that James's future depended on appropriate choices. Stability required distance. Ambition demanded focus. No one said Diep's name out loud, but it hovered between every sentence, unspoken yet unmistakable. James understood the message clearly. There were doors that would open only if certain ties were quietly left behind. At night, when the city finally grew quieter, doubt crept in. Was power truly worth the silence it demanded? Could he climb higher while carrying a heart that refused to harden? James knew this was only the beginning of a choice that would not remain theoretical for long. Somewhere ahead waited a moment when hesitation would no longer be possible. And when that moment came, he wondered, would he have the courage to trade everything he had built for the one thing that made him feel alive? Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping into the city like an uninvited guest. The streets filled again, coffee cups in hand, faces fixed on routine. Yet inside James, everything felt unsettled. He drove past familiar roads, but his mind wandered elsewhere, back to a small kitchen where Diep once stood, tying her hair with careless grace, asking him if he had eaten yet. Such a simple question, yet it echoed louder than any executive briefing. At the office, the air was sharp with expectation. Meetings followed one another in a relentless rhythm, numbers rising and falling on glowing screens. Applause came easily when James spoke, respect wrapped neatly around his name. From the outside, he looked unshakable, but inside, each decision felt heavier than the last. Power no longer tasted sweet. It felt dry, demanding more than it gave. Every signature seemed to pull him further away from the quiet life Diep represented. During a brief pause, his phone vibrated. A message from Diep. Nothing dramatic, just a photo of lunch she had cooked. A short line. "Hope your day isn't too tiring." James stared at the screen longer than he should have. In that moment, the world slowed. He imagined sitting across from her, sharing ordinary complaints, laughing at things that didn't matter. It was a life without titles, without applause, yet it felt dangerously complete.
The tension grew as whispers became clearer. An older executive spoke to him privately, voice calm but firm. "You're at a turning point," he said. "What you choose now will define your legacy." The implication was unmistakable. Some lives fit neatly into powerful narratives, others complicated them. James nodded, outwardly composed, while something inside him resisted, aching like a bruise pressed too often. That evening, he didn't go home right away. He walked instead, blending into the crowd, watching couples argue over dinner plans, parents scolding children, vendors closing their stalls. These ordinary scenes stirred something restless within him. Everyone seemed to be choosing something: comfort over dreams, love over pride, or sometimes the opposite. There was no applause for these choices, only consequences quietly carried. When James finally met Diep that night, their conversation was gentle, almost careful. She spoke of small plans, of tomorrow, of things she hoped for but never demanded. Her eyes searched his face, sensing the distance he tried to hide. James realized then that silence itself was a choice, and it was already costing him more than he had expected. The question was no longer whether he could choose power or Diep, but how long he could pretend not to choose at all.
The rain began without warning, thin at first, then heavier, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. James stood alone in his office, the city lights below him blurred by water and doubt. Nights like these had once energized him, late hours, bold decisions, the thrill of control. But now, the silence pressed closer, asking questions no contract could silence. Earlier that day, the offer had finally been spoken aloud. Clear, tempting, dangerous. A path back to unquestioned authority, influence beyond measure, on one condition only. Diep must disappear quietly from his public life. No scandal, no explanation, just distance, wrapped in excuses. The words had sounded reasonable in the conference room, delivered with practiced sympathy. Yet, as soon as James was alone, they echoed like a verdict. He remembered Diep's laughter, light and sudden, filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. He remembered how she listened, not to his success, but to his fears. With her, he was not a symbol or a name on paper. He was simply James, a man allowed to be unsure. The memory felt warm, then painful, like touching something you might lose.
That evening, he drove aimlessly, rain streaking across the windshield. Traffic slowed, horns flared, strangers muttered complaints. Ordinary chaos. James watched it all with distant eyes, realizing how similar his life had become to this road, crowded, loud, always moving, yet somehow stuck. He wondered how many people around him were also standing at invisible crossroads, pretending everything was fine. When he reached Diep's place, the lights were on. She opened the door wearing a tired smile, concern flickering across her face. They sat in silence longer than usual, the kind that grows when words feel risky. Finally, James spoke, not of deals or demands, but of fear. Fear of losing everything he had built. Fear of losing himself if he didn't let it go. Diep listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Whatever you choose," she said, "don't choose it because you're afraid." Her words landed gently, yet they shook him more than any ultimatum ever could. As James left, the rain eased, leaving the air strangely clear. He knew the decision was close now. Not tomorrow, not someday, very soon. And for the first time, he understood that choosing Diep or choosing power was not just about sacrifice, it was about deciding who he was willing to become.
Morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested on James's face, warm but uncertain. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of life beginning again. Footsteps in the hallway, a motorbike starting somewhere far below, the faint call of a street vendor. Ordinary sounds, real sounds. They reminded him that life was happening, whether he decided or not. By noon, the moment he had been avoiding finally stood in front of him. The meeting room was cold,
polished and perfectly arranged, just like the future they were offering him. Faces around the table watched closely, waiting for a single sentence that would secure their plans. Power sat within reach, silent and patient. All James had to do was agree. For a brief second, his old self stirred, tempted by certainty, by the comfort of control. But then, unexpectedly, another image surfaced. Diep standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly messy, smiling at nothing in particular. No spotlight, no applause, just peace. That memory carried weight, not heavy like obligation, but deep like truth.
This story reminds us that not all victories are measured by status, wealth, or control. Sometimes the hardest choices are not between right and wrong, but between what looks powerful and what truly feels meaningful. James's struggle teaches us that living according to others' expectations can slowly silence our own voice, even when the rewards seem impressive. True courage lies in listening to that quiet inner truth, the one that appears in ordinary moments, in simple memories, and in the people who make us feel at peace. Choosing love, integrity, and emotional honesty often requires giving up comfort and certainty. It may lead to misunderstanding, loss, or judgment from the world around us. Yet those sacrifices open the door to a life that feels genuine rather than impressive. The lesson is also about balance. Responsibility to family, society, and ambition is important, but it should not come at the cost of one's humanity. Power without purpose becomes empty, while love without self-respect becomes fragile. When we learn to choose with clarity instead of fear, we begin to live more fully. In the end, happiness is not found in what we own or control, but in who we choose to stand beside and who we choose to become. Another quiet lesson hidden within this story is that love is not always loud or dramatic. Often it is patient, unseen, and tested by time. Diep's presence shows us that real love does not demand immediate answers or perfect outcomes. It waits, not because it is weak, but because it believes. In daily life, we are often taught to chase results quickly, to win, to prove, to succeed. Yet the story reminds us that some things grow only when we allow them the space to breathe. James's hesitation reflects a truth many people face. Fear of disappointing others can be stronger than fear of losing oneself. When family, tradition, or power stand before us, choosing our own path can feel like betrayal. But the lesson here is not about rebellion. It is about responsibility to one's own soul. Ignoring that responsibility may lead to a life that looks successful from the outside, but feels hollow inside. This story also teaches us about timing. Not every choice can be made immediately, and not every answer arrives when we want it to. Life moves in waves, sometimes calm, sometimes overwhelming. During uncertain moments, the small acts of kindness, honesty, and perseverance matter more than grand decisions. These are the moments that shape character quietly, day by day. Finally, the lesson invites us to reflect on what we are truly willing to trade. Power, recognition, and comfort are tempting, but they should never cost us our compassion or identity. When we choose with awareness, understanding both loss and gain, we begin to live with fewer regrets. Life does not reward those who choose perfectly, but it honors those who choose sincerely. In the end, the greatest strength is not in control or authority, but in the courage to remain human, to love without fear, and to walk a path that aligns with the heart, even when that path is uncertain.